My daughter thought I did not see her put a strange substance into my soup. When she walked away, I switched our plates. You will not believe what happened next. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The evening began like any other Sunday tradition inside the walls of my $6 million Cherry Creek mansion. The cold Colorado sun was setting over the mountains, casting golden shadows across the vaulted ceilings and the polished hardwood floors of the grand dining room. I am Harrison Cole. I spent 40 grueling years building Cole commercial properties from a single rundown storefront into a real estate empire that dominates the Denver skyline. I gave everything to my work, and by extension, my family. After my beloved wife Patricia passed away 4 years ago, the silence in this massive house became suffocating. I thought passing the torch would bring us closer together. 1 year ago, I stepped down, handing the title of Chief Executive Officer to my only daughter, Natalie. I took a back seat as chairman of the board, hoping to spend my twilight years in peace, enjoying the fruits of my lifelong labor. I trusted her implicitly. She was my blood. That evening, Natalie and her husband, Derek, had come over for our weekly family dinner. Derek was a sharp-dressed man of 38, supposedly a brilliant director of venture capital. He had an annoying habit of talking too fast and smiling too wide, but Natalie claimed she loved him, so I welcomed him into my home. The air in the house smelled richly of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. But the main course was my absolute favorite, a hearty clam chowder. Natalie had insisted on heating it up and serving it herself. She stood in my gourmet kitchen, her back completely turned to me, stirring the pot. I was sitting in the adjacent formal dining room, resting comfortably in my high-backed mahogany chair. I was playing the role of the tired, aging patriarch perfectly. To my left hung a massive antique gilded mirror that Patricia and I had purchased in Paris decades ago. It spanned nearly floor to ceiling, providing a perfect, unobstructed reflection of the expansive kitchen behind me. I was simply staring into the mirror, letting my mind wander over old memories, when my daughter reached into her pocket. My breath instantly caught in my throat. I watched, paralyzed by a sudden icy wave of absolute disbelief, as Natalie pulled out a small, unlabeled glass vial. She uncapped it swiftly with her thumb. Her eyes darted quickly toward the dining room doorway, checking to see if I was looking in her direction. She could not see my eyes fixed directly on the antique mirror. With a cold, calculated stare that I simply did not recognize, my own flesh and blood tipped the vial over the porcelain bowl she had specifically set aside for me. 1, 2, 3 clear drops vanished seamlessly into the thick white soup. She quickly slipped the empty vial back into her pocket and grabbed a wooden spoon. A terrifying chill ran down my spine, sinking deep into my aging bones. My mind raced at 1,000,000 miles an hour, desperately trying to process the betrayal playing out in the reflection. My daughter, the little girl I had proudly taught to ride a bicycle, the grown woman to whom I had just handed a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. She was poisoning my food. The ruthless instinct of a man who had spent decades crushing cutthroat competitors on the open market kicked in. The initial shock evaporated into thin air, instantly replaced by a cold, hardened, absolute resolve. I did not yell. I did not confront her. I needed to know exactly how deep this sickening rot went. Natalie turned her back to the island counter, taking 3 brisk steps toward the walk-in pantry to grab a set of folded linen napkins. She was completely out of sight for exactly 5 seconds. It was all the time I needed. I rose from my chair with a speed and silence she would never expect from a 70-year-old man. I stepped quietly to the kitchen island, picked up the poisoned bowl intended for me, and swiftly swapped it with the identical clean bowl meant for her. I slid back into my mahogany chair, resting my hands neatly on my lap, forcing my breathing to remain perfectly even and calm. Seconds later, Natalie walked into the dining room holding the folded napkins and wearing a sweet, flawless, loving smile. Derek followed right behind her, carrying a bottle of expensive, sparkling water. He looked unusually jittery, his eyes constantly avoiding mine as he quickly sat down across the long wooden table. "Here you go, Dad," Natalie said, her voice dripping with artificial, sickly sweet warmth. She placed the poisoned bowl directly in front of her own chair and set the clean bowl right in front of me. "I made sure yours is extra hot just the way you always like it. You have been looking so incredibly tired lately. You really need to eat well and get some deep, uninterrupted rest tonight." "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied, forcing my voice to sound raspy and soft. I looked her dead in the eyes, actively searching for a tiny flicker of guilt, a brief hint of hesitation. There was absolutely nothing, just the chilling, calm exterior of a silent predator, patiently waiting for its unsuspecting prey to fall. I picked up my heavy silver spoon and slowly stirred my chowder. I blew on it deliberately, making a grand show of taking my time. "It smells absolutely wonderful, Natalie. It really does. I am so lucky to have a daughter who looks out for my health." Derek shifted uncomfortably in his leather seat, nervously picking at his fingernails under the table. "We just want what is best for you, Harrison," he mumbled quietly, staring strictly down at his empty plate. "You have been carrying a massive load for far too long." "That I have Derek. That I have," I murmured softly. I raised my spoon halfway to my mouth, then paused, intentionally resting it back on the edge of the bowl. "Go ahead, Natalie. You eat first. You spent the time cooking it after all." Natalie smiled brightly, completely oblivious to the deadly trap she had just walked into. She picked up her spoon and dipped it deep into the thick soup. I watched with intense, unblinking focus as she raised the spoon to her lips. She took a bite, then a second, then a third eager spoonful, swallowing it down without a single second thought. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Mid-sentence, while asking Derek to pour the water, Natalie suddenly froze. Her pupils dilated massively. She dropped her spoon, gasped for air, and collapsed face first into her bowl, convulsing. Derek panicked, screaming loudly. I slowly dialed 911, observing his guilty reaction. The emergency operator answered on the second ring. Her calm, steady voice crackled through the speaker of my phone, asking the nature of my emergency. I forced my voice to tremble, projecting the exact pitch of a terrified, helpless old man watching his only child slip away. I told her my daughter was having a severe seizure, that she could not breathe, that her face was turning a horrifying shade of pale blue. All the while, my eyes never left Derek. He was on his knees beside her, shaking her shoulders, screaming her name in a high, unnatural pitch. His panic was loud, messy, and entirely theatrical. A husband truly terrified for his dying wife would be focused on clearing her airway or checking her pulse. Derek, however, kept darting his eyes toward the dining table. He was looking at the soup bowls. He was looking at my hands. He was trying to figure out how the meticulously planned execution of a 70-year-old billionaire had suddenly backfired onto his own wife. I gave him nothing. I dropped my phone to the hardwood floor, letting the dispatcher listen to the chaos, and knelt beside my daughter. I placed my hands gently on her shaking shoulders, playing my part to absolute perfection. I cried out her name, pleading with her to hold on, begging Derek to do something. Inside my mind, however, an entirely different scene was playing out. The dining room around me seemed to fade into a blur of sound and motion. As I watched Natalie gasp for breath, her manicured fingers clawing at the expensive Persian rug, my thoughts drifted back to a pristine morning, exactly 12 months ago. We were standing in the glass-enclosed boardroom of Cole Commercial Properties. That morning, I had officially handed her the keys to my kingdom. I had stood before our board of directors, my heart swelling with immense fatherly pride, and announced that Natalie would be the new chief executive officer. I remembered the tears of joy welling up in her eyes as she hugged me tightly in front of the flashing cameras. I remembered how she whispered in my ear, promising that she would protect our family legacy with her life. I had believed every single word. I had worked 80-hour weeks for 4 decades to build that empire. I sacrificed weekends, holidays, and countless family dinners just to ensure she would never have to struggle. I gave her the world on a silver platter, asking for nothing in return, except honesty and basic respect. And this was my reward. A lethal cocktail hidden inside a bowl of clam chowder served with a bright, loving smile. The stark contrast between the daughter I thought I had raised and the ruthless stranger convulsing on my floor was almost too much to process. The violent spasms rocking her body began to slow down, replaced by a terrifying, shallow wheezing. Derek grabbed my shoulder, his grip painfully tight. He pulled me back, shouting that we needed to give her space. His eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate energy. I realized in that fraction of a second that he was terrified she might actually die. If Natalie died, his direct connection to my wealth died with her. He would be left with nothing but his own colossal failures. The wail of approaching sirens finally pierced the cold evening air, growing louder as they sped down the winding streets of Cherry Creek. The heavy oak front door was flung open. 3 paramedics rushed into the grand dining room, carrying heavy medical bags and oxygen equipment. They shoved us aside immediately, taking over. The lead paramedic, a tall man with a stern face, began barking out sharp questions. How long had she been seizing? Does she have a history of epilepsy? Did she ingest any known allergens or strange medications? I stood back, clutching my chest perfectly, mimicking the shock of a frail, terrified father. I let Derek do the talking. I wanted to hear exactly how he would spin this catastrophic failure to the medical professionals trying to save her. Derek stumbled over his words, waving his hands frantically. He told them she had been under massive amounts of stress at work. He claimed she had no medical history of seizures and that she had only eaten a few spoonfuls of soup before collapsing. He conveniently omitted any mention of herbal sleep aids or sudden medication drops. He was actively withholding crucial medical information that could save her life simply to protect his own skin. It was a staggering display of pure, unadulterated cowardice. The paramedics did not have time to interrogate him further. They strapped an oxygen mask firmly over Natalie's pale face and swiftly lifted her onto a collapsible stretcher. The entire house was illuminated by the flashing red and white lights of the ambulance parked in my circular driveway. As they wheeled her out into the freezing night air, Derek rushed to grab his coat. He turned to me, his face a mask of manufactured concern. He told me to stay at the house to rest, and that he would call me as soon as they had an update from the emergency room. He wanted me far away from the hospital. He wanted me isolated, leaving him completely free to construct whatever plausible lie he needed to tell the doctors. I shook my head firmly, leaning heavily against the dining room archway for dramatic effect. I told him there was absolutely no way I was letting my only daughter leave without me. I demanded to ride in the back of the ambulance, but the paramedics quickly refused, stating they needed clear space to work on her unstable vitals. I compromised by insisting I would follow directly behind them in my own car. Derek swallowed hard, unable to argue without looking suspicious. I quickly grabbed my heavy wool coat and my keys, but before I walked out the front door, I made one final crucial move. I slipped back into the dining room under the pretense of grabbing my reading glasses. I took a small, sterile plastic container from my pocket and scraped a generous sample of the thick white soup from Natalie's dropped spoon and the edge of her bowl. I sealed the container tightly and tucked it deep inside my inner breast pocket. This was my insurance policy. This was the irrefutable evidence I would need to uncover the truth. I walked out into the biting Colorado cold, climbed into my dark sedan, and followed the blaring sirens down the mountain toward Denver Health. My tired hands gripped the cold leather steering wheel with an absolutely unwavering iron intensity. The deep sadness I had felt only an hour ago was completely gone now, burned away by the sheer audacity of their betrayal. My daughter and my son-in-law had decided to play a deadly game of chess with my life. They assumed I was just a blind, trusting old fool. They were about to learn exactly why I was the one who built the empire from scratch and why I would never let them destroy it. The drive down to Denver Health was a blur of flashing lights and adrenaline. When I pulled my sedan into the emergency parking lot, The freezing night air hit my face like a physical blow. I handed my keys to the valet and walked through the sliding glass doors. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow on the linoleum floors. I approached the front desk, projecting the image of a frantic, deeply concerned father. The receptionist directed me to a private waiting area just outside the intensive care unit. Derek was already there, pacing back and forth with a forced, restless energy. His designer suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, and he was violently running his hands through his hair. I sat down heavily in a plastic chair, watching him. The pristine, sterile environment of the hospital stood in sharp contrast to the dirty reality of what had just occurred in my dining room. I let the silence stretch between us, allowing Derek to stew in his own rising panic. Nurses and orderlies rushed past us in a continuous blur of blue scrubs and hushed voices. Through the small rectangular window of the swinging double doors, I caught brief, chaotic glimpses of the trauma team working on my daughter. They were moving with urgent precision, inserting tubes, checking monitors, and performing a rapid gastric lavage. Pumping her stomach was a brutal procedure, but it was necessary to purge whatever toxic substance she attempted to feed me. I sat there, my hands folded neatly over my knees, maintaining a facade of anxious grief while my mind calculated every possible angle. After what felt like an eternity, the lad emergency physician pushed through the swinging doors. He pulled off his surgical mask and sighed, walking toward us with a tired but relieved expression. He explained that they had successfully stabilized her vitals and cleared her stomach contents. She was resting now, weak and groggy, but she was going to survive. He mentioned they were sending the stomach fluids to the toxicology lab to identify the exact compound she had ingested, as her symptoms were unusually aggressive. Derek nodded vigorously, thanking the doctor profusely, his voice dripping with exaggerated gratitude. Once the physician walked away down the long corridor, Derek slowly turned to face me. He took a deep, shuddering breath, clearly preparing to deliver the performance of a lifetime. He stepped closer, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder, looking at me with wide, supposedly earnest eyes. He told me we needed to talk before I went into her room. He spoke in a hushed, conspiratorial whisper, leaning in close so the passing nurses could not hear. He told me Natalie had been battling severe, crushing executive burnout for the past 6 months. He claimed the pressure of running coal commercial properties was slowly breaking her down, causing her immense anxiety and sleepless nights. Then he delivered the lie. He said the liquid in the vial was nothing more than a highly concentrated herbal sleep aid, a heavy natural tincture meant to induce deep sleep. He looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured sorrow. He said Natalie knew I had been complaining about my own insomnia lately, how I had been struggling to get a full night of rest since Patricia passed away. According to Derek, my sweet, exhausted daughter simply wanted to help her aging father catch a break. She wanted to slip a few drops into my soup so I would sleep soundly through the night. But he claimed in her extreme exhaustion and mental fog, she had clumsily mixed up the bowls on the kitchen island. I listened to his entire explanation without blinking, without moving a single muscle. It was an incredibly sophisticated, perfectly plausible lie. It painted Natalie not as an attempted murderer, but as a loving, overworked daughter who had made a tragic, innocent mistake. It provided a neat, tidy excuse for the presence of the vial and the sudden poisoning. If I had not seen the cold, calculating, predatory look in her eyes through the dining room mirror, I might have actually believed him. I might have hugged him, thanked him for his honesty, and rushed in to comfort my poor, stressed child. But I knew the truth. I knew that whatever was in that vial was designed to do far more than just help me sleep. Still, I nodded slowly, letting out a long, trembling sigh. I reached up and patted his hand, playing the role of the relieved, forgiving father. I told him I understood. I told him how much I appreciated him looking out for her, and that the only thing that mattered now was that she was safe and alive. I watched the tension completely drain from his shoulders. He let out a massive sigh of relief, clearly convinced that I had swallowed his pathetic story, hook, line, and sinker. He gestured toward the hospital room door, encouraging me to go inside and see her. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the dimly lit hospital room. Natalie was lying in the center of a narrow hospital bed, hooked up to a series of heart monitors and intravenous lines. Her skin was incredibly pale, her lips lacking their usual color, and she looked genuinely fragile. As I approached the side of the bed, her eyes fluttered open. The moment she saw me, tears began to stream rapidly down her cheeks. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers grasping weakly at my coat sleeve. She began to weep bitterly, her chest heaving with deep, dramatic sobs. She apologized profusely, her voice cracking with pure emotion. She told me she was so sorry for being so stupid, for making such a reckless, clumsy mistake. She repeated Derek's exact story, crying about her executive burnout, her overwhelming exhaustion, and how desperately she just wanted to help me sleep better. She held my hand tightly against her wet cheek, begging for my forgiveness. She told me she loved me more than anything in the world, and that she never meant to cause a scene or ruin our Sunday family dinner. It was a masterful, flawless, tear-filled performance that belonged on a silver screen. She hit every emotional note perfectly, projecting absolute vulnerability and deep regret. I leaned over the hospital bed and wrapped my arms around her shaking shoulders. I kissed her forehead gently, tasting the salty tears on her skin. I told her to stop apologizing. I told her I loved her, that everything was going to be fine, and we would get through this stressful period together. I smoothed her hair, acting as the ultimate pillar of comfort. But as I held my crying daughter in my arms, feeling her steady heartbeat against my chest, my own heart was completely encased in ice. I knew every single tear staining her face was a calculated deception. She was not crying because she made a mistake. She was crying because her lethal plan failed. I pulled away, giving her a reassuring smile before stepping into the hallway. I had survived her deadly trap. I pulled away, giving her a reassuring smile before stepping into the hallway. I had survived her deadly trap. The heavy hospital door clicked shut behind me, severing the connections to her weeping performance. I stood alone in the sterile corridor, letting the cool antiseptic air fill my lungs. My hands steady while holding my sobbing daughter finally allowed themselves a slight tremble. I shoved them deep into the pockets of my wool coat, gripping the small plastic container of tainted soup. I had spent 40 years navigating the cutthroat world of commercial real estate. Right now, every alarm bell in my mind was ringing with deafening intensity. A heavy herbal sleep aid does not cause sudden respiratory failure. A simple botanical tincture does not trigger violent seizures within 60 seconds of ingestion. I knew it. Derek knew it. And Natalie certainly knew it. Derek was waiting near the nurse's station, pacing nervously. When he saw me approach, he quickly tossed the paper aside and jogged over wearing a mask of profound relief. He asked how she was doing, his voice trembling with manufactured concern. I patted his shoulder, mirroring his feigned relief. I told him she was resting comfortably, that she felt terrible about the mix-up, and that the doctors expected a full recovery by morning. I watched his shoulders drop. He truly thought I was just a tired, gullible old man who would blindly accept any excuse wrapped in a daughter's tears. I told Derek I was going to drive over to their penthouse to pack comfortable clothes and toiletries for Natalie. He immediately offered to go instead, a flash of panic crossing his eyes. He said I had been through enough stress and needed rest. I waved off his concern with a gentle smile. I insisted he needed to stay right here by his wife's side. I reminded him a devoted husband never leaves his wife in the hospital alone. Cornered by his own fabricated narrative, Derek had absolutely no choice but to agree. He handed over his heavy keys with a tight, reluctant nod. The long drive to their sprawling downtown penthouse was a blur of flashing neon city lights and dark, swirling paranoia. I navigated the familiar streets of Denver, my mind dissecting the events. Why would my only child want me dead? Was it simple greed, impatience to claim her inheritance? Or was there a darker, more urgent financial fire she was desperately trying to extinguish? I pulled into the underground parking garage of the luxury high-rise, a building my own firm had constructed a decade ago. I took the private elevator straight up to the penthouse suite. When I finally unlocked the heavy double doors, I was greeted by an absolute chilling silence. The penthouse was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering city skyline. I had bought them this place as a wedding gift to ensure my daughter lived in ultimate comfort. Now standing in the dark foyer, the expensive Italian leather furniture felt like a grotesque monument to my own blind generosity. I walked down the long hallway toward the master suite, turning on a single bedside lamp. The large bedroom smelled faintly of Natalie's extremely expensive French perfume. I moved to her massive walk-in closet, pulling a small duffel bag from the top shelf. I methodically packed a pair of soft sweatpants, a cashmere sweater, and warm socks. I walked into the adjoining master bathroom to gather her toothbrush and skincare products. The bathroom was pristine, lined with mirrored cabinets and polished quartz. I opened the medicine cabinet, grabbing her prescribed moisturizer and a hairbrush. As I reached for a small velvet pouch on the vanity counter, I accidentally knocked over a heavy decorative wooden box. It hit the cold tiled floor with a sudden loud thud, the bottom panel springing wide open upon impact. I froze, staring down at the shattered box. It was not just a decorative piece. It featured a hidden felt-lined false bottom. Lying right there on the pristine white tiles, completely exposed, was a cheap black prepaid burner phone. My heart hammered fiercely against my ribs as I slowly crouched down to pick it up. A woman who runs a legitimate multi-million-dollar real estate empire does not need a hidden, untraceable prepaid phone tucked inside a secret compartment in her bathroom vanity. I pressed the small power button on the side. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across my face. It was not protected by a password or a biometric lock, likely because Natalie assumed nobody would ever find it. The battery sat at 15%. There were no saved contacts, apps, or browsing history. It was used for one purpose only. I quickly opened the hidden messaging application. There was only a single active text thread. The number attached to the thread was heavily encrypted, masked by a routing service to prevent location tracking. The messages were sparse, chillingly brief, and completely devoid of emotional context. My eyes scanned the most recent message received just 3 hours ago, right around the time I had arrived at my mansion for our Sunday dinner. The bright, glowing text read, "Did the old man take the bait? The deadline is next Friday." The words burned into my retinas, hitting me with the force of a physical blow. The old man, the bait, the deadline. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in my mind, forming a terrifying, undeniable picture. Natalie had not acted in a momentary lapse of judgment. This was a highly coordinated, meticulously planned execution. The poisoned soup was the bait, and whoever was on the other side of this encrypted phone was waiting for confirmation of my death. The mention of a strict Friday deadline sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. This was not a casual inheritance scheme. Deadlines always meant mounting debt. Deadlines meant ruthless people demanding immediate payment. Deadlines meant severe consequences if the required funds were not produced on time. Derek and Natalie were not just greedy. They were trapped. They owed someone an astronomical amount of money, and my massive personal trust fund was their only viable exit strategy. I was not just a father to them anymore. I was a breathing bank account that needed to be liquidated before the weekend. I just stared at the small glowing screen for a long, silent moment. I took my smartphone and photographed the burner phone, capturing the encrypted number, timestamp, and terrifying message. I wiped the phone clean of fingerprints using a tissue and placed it back into the felt-lined compartment, reattaching the false bottom. I set the wooden box back on the vanity counter. I zipped up the duffel bag, my movements deliberate. I turned off the lamp, casting the suite back into darkness. As I locked the heavy doors, I realized the trusting father had died the moment that poison touched the soup. In his place was the ruthless founder of Cole Commercial Properties. The wolf had returned, and I was going to tear their entire world to shreds. The drive back to my Cherry Creek mansion felt remarkably different from the panicked race to the hospital. My hands were perfectly steady on the steering wheel. The suffocating weight of betrayal had crystallized into a sharp, tactical clarity. I walked slowly through the silent, empty halls of my estate and carefully placed the container of tainted soup into a secure, climate-controlled safe hidden in my study. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my favorite leather armchair watching the sun rise over the Denver skyline, calculating my next moves. By mid-morning, Derek called to inform me that Natalie was being officially discharged. She was weak, he said, but recovering beautifully from her terrible, clumsy mistake. I played the relieved father, expressing my profound gratitude to the medical staff, and told him to take her straight to their penthouse to rest. I fully expected a day of quiet preparation. I expected time to quietly assemble my trusted legal and private security teams. I was entirely wrong. Less than 2 hours after that phone call, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the foyer. I opened it to find Derek standing on my porch. He was not alone. Beside him stood a tall, remarkably polished man carrying a sleek leather medical bag. The stranger possessed a practiced smile and wore a charcoal suit that looked far too expensive for a general practitioner. Derek stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. He introduced the man as Dr. Mercer, an exclusive private physician who catered to high-net-worth clients in the Denver area. Derek explained that after the emotional exhaustion of the previous night, he wanted a medical professional to check my stress levels. He claimed he was simply worried about my heart, my blood pressure, and my overall health condition. It sounded so incredibly thoughtful. It sounded like the actions of a devoted son-in-law. But I saw the slight nervous twitch in Derek's jaw. I saw the way Dr. Mercer's cold eyes quickly scanned the opulence of my home, calculating its worth in a single second. I invited them into the formal living room, gesturing for the doctor to take a seat on the plush velvet sofa. Dr. Mercer did not pull out a stethoscope or a blood pressure cuff. Instead, he pulled out a slim digital tablet and a silver pen. He leaned forward, adopting a tone of deep empathy. He began by asking how I slept. When I told him I struggled with insomnia, a fact Derek already knew perfectly well, the doctor nodded slowly, typing on his screen. Then the questions began to shift. They moved away from physical stress and crept insidiously toward cognitive function. He asked if I ever found myself misplacing objects around the large house. He inquired if I had experienced any sudden moments of disorientation during my daily walks. He suggested that grief could manifest as paranoia, asking if I ever felt my family members were keeping secrets from me. He framed every single question as a natural consequence of aging and mourning, wrapping his insidious interrogation in a warm blanket of medical concern. While the doctor spoke, Derek hovered in the wide, arched doorway of the living room. He refused to sit down. He stood with his arms crossed, nodding eagerly at every symptom Dr. Mercer suggested. When the doctor asked about my memory, Derek chimed in immediately. He reminded me of a minor scheduling error I had made 3 months ago regarding a board meeting, inflating the small mistake into a major incident of cognitive decline. He told the doctor that I had been increasingly forgetful, that my legendary sharp mind was starting to slip, and that the entire family was becoming deeply concerned for my safety. As I sat there listening to my son-in-law build a fictional narrative of my mental decay, the true brilliance of their horrific plan washed over me. The poisoned soup was never meant to kill me instantly. The lethal dose Natalie consumed was a catastrophic miscalculation. The original plan was to dose me slowly, day after day, week after week. The synthetic neuroinhibitor was designed to systematically destroy my brain function. They wanted to simulate late-stage Alzheimer's disease. And Dr. Mercer was the final piece of the puzzle. He was here to establish a documented, legally binding medical history of dementia. They were building a paper trail to prove I was losing my mind, paving the way to declare me legally incompetent. The sheer audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. If I reacted with anger, Dr. Mercer would simply document my outburst as a paranoid delusion. Any attempt to defend myself would only cement their fabricated diagnosis. I had to play their game, and I had to play it better than they ever could. I let out a long, shaky sigh, letting my shoulders slump forward. I lowered my gaze to the floor, adopting the posture of a tired, defeated old man who was finally confronting his own frailty. I lifted my right hand to rub my temple purposefully, allowing my fingers to tremble. It was a subtle shake, just enough to catch the trained eye of the corrupt physician sitting across from me. I saw Dr. Mercer glance at my trembling hand, his fingers moving quickly across his digital tablet. "I suppose you might be right," I whispered, injecting a distinct note of vulnerability into my voice. "The house is so large, and since Patricia passed, the days just seem to blend together. Sometimes I walk into a room and completely forget why I am there." Derek stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with suppressed triumph. He placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, exchanging a swift, victorious look with the doctor. "It is entirely normal, Dad. You have worked so hard for so long. We just want to make sure you are properly protected." I looked at the physician, squinting slightly as if struggling to recall a simple detail. "I am sorry, what did you say your name was again, Doctor? My mind is just a bit clouded this morning." "Dr. Mercer Harrison. We were just introduced at the door," he replied, his voice dripping with condescending patience. "Right. Of course. Dr. Mercer. Please forgive me." I leaned back in my chair, continuing the fragile facade. We spoke for another 20 minutes. During that time, I deliberately lost my train of thought. I repeated a story about my late wife, twice acting unaware that I had just told it. And before they left, I asked the physician for his name a second time. The satisfaction radiating from Derek was palpable. He believed he had won. He believed I was a fading old man, completely ripe for the taking. He had no idea that every tremor, every forgotten name, and every hesitant word was a calculated move. I watched them walk out to their car, waving weakly from the porch. The moment their vehicle disappeared down the street, my hand stopped trembling. The performance was completely over. Now it was time to assemble my wolves. The following morning broke with a bitter chill sweeping down from the Rocky Mountains. I dressed in my sharpest tailored suit, selecting a deep charcoal fabric that projected absolute authority. I drove my vintage classic car through downtown Denver, actively processing the terrifying revelations of the previous night. I pulled up to the towering glass skyscraper housing the global headquarters of Cole Commercial Properties. My name was proudly etched in polished bronze above the revolving glass doors. Walking into the grand lobby used to feel like coming home. Today, the atmosphere felt entirely different. It felt heavy, sterile, and distinctly unwelcoming. Crossing the expansive marble floor toward the private executive elevators, I noticed subtle shifts in behavior. The security guards offered stiff, uncomfortable nods rather than their usual warm greetings. Longtime employees, people I had personally mentored and promoted, quickly averted their eyes as I passed. A few sharply turned down adjacent hallways, actively avoiding direct interaction. The joyful energy that used to define my company had been completely suffocated. In its place was an undeniable, suffocating tension. My daughter was clearly ruling through fear and isolation. I stepped into the mirrored executive elevator and pressed the button for the 50th floor. The smooth ascent gave me a moment to steady my breathing. I had to walk into the lion's den, projecting weakness, not strength. The silver doors parted with a soft chime, and I stepped onto the plush carpet of the executive suite. The reception area was eerily quiet. Natalie's massive corner office was situated at the far end, but she was thankfully absent, presumably still resting at home after her catastrophic failure. Their absence gave me the perfect window of opportunity to conduct my investigation. I bypassed the main executive corridor and headed straight for the financial wing. Pushing open the frosted glass door to the accounting department, I entered a sprawling maze of sleek modern desks and glowing monitors. The moment I entered, the low hum of office conversation died instantly. The silence was deafening. I ignored the nervous stares and walked directly toward the corner office belonging to the chief financial officer. Gregory was a meticulous, cautious man I had recruited from a rival firm a decade ago. Gregory was hunched over his massive desk, deeply engrossed in a spreadsheet, when I tapped gently on the open doorframe. He jumped slightly, his head snapping up. When he saw me standing there, all the color completely drained from his face. He scrambled to his feet, awkwardly, knocking a stack of file folders onto the floor. He smoothed his tie, his hands visibly trembling, and offered a weak, faltering greeting. I stepped into his office and gently closed the door behind me. I dropped my shoulders, adopting the posture of a tired old man. "Good morning, Gregory," I said, keeping my voice gentle and slightly raspy. "I know I have been taking a step back lately, enjoying my retirement, but I woke up today feeling a bit nostalgic. I would like to review the complete unredacted cash flow reports for the third quarter. Just for my own peace of mind, of course." Gregory swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. A bead of sweat formed near his hairline. He looked at the closed door, then back to me, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He stammered, clearing his throat twice before managing to produce a coherent sentence. He told me that he would love to provide those reports, but there was a significant administrative problem. He practically choked on the words as he tried to explain the situation to me. According to Gregory, exactly 3 weeks ago, Derek completely overhauled the internal accounting system. Derek claimed the company was vulnerable to cyber threats and required an immediate mandatory security upgrade. He brought in an outside tech firm bypassing our internal IT department to install a heavily encrypted multi-tiered ledger system. The new protocol completely compartmentalized the company's financial data. Gregory, the man responsible for balancing the books of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, no longer had access to the master accounts. He could only see the operating expenses. I stared at him, letting the devastating gravity of his words hang in the silent air. I asked him, my voice trembling with genuine shock, who possessed the master decryption key. Gregory lowered his head, unable to meet my gaze. He whispered that the only person with absolute administrative access, the only individual who could view the consolidated funds and authorize large wire transfers, was the chief executive officer. Natalie held the only key. Derek had built the encrypted fortress, and my daughter was standing guard at the gate. The pieces of the horrific puzzle were finally snapping together, forming a picture far more terrifying than a simple inheritance grab. They had fundamentally hijacked the core financial infrastructure of my entire corporation. They had locked the founder, the board, and the top financial officers completely out of the vault. A company does not implement an unbreachable siloed accounting system unless it is actively trying to hide a massive financial black hole. They were actively moving money in the absolute dark without any corporate oversight. The encrypted text message I had found on Natalie's burner phone echoed loudly in my mind. "The deadline is next Friday." That single terrifying sentence took on a monumental new meaning. They needed money, a staggering amount of money, to cover whatever disastrous financial crater they had dug. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. My daughter and her husband were not just greedy heirs waiting for me to die. They were desperate, cornered animals fighting for survival. They had likely leveraged the company's pristine assets, perhaps illegally borrowing against my most valuable skyscrapers, and now the bill was coming due. They were out of their depth. "I understand, Gregory," I murmured softly, letting out a long, defeated sigh. I played the part of a confused, overwhelmed elderly man who simply could not grasp the complexities of modern digital security. I thanked him for his time and told him not to worry about the reports, claiming I would simply ask Natalie to explain it all to me when she felt better. Gregory looked incredibly relieved, eagerly agreeing that Natalie would be the best person to translate the new technical protocols. I slowly turned and walked out of his office, keeping my steps measured and hesitant. As I navigated the silent, tense corridors back to the executive elevator, my mind was operating with razor-sharp precision. They thought they had secured all the doors. They thought they had locked me out of my own life's work. They believed their encrypted walls were impenetrable and that my aging mind was far too weak to comprehend their intricate corporate sabotage. They had no idea that their elaborate, highly technical fortress was built on a foundation of sheer arrogance. I entered the mirrored elevator quietly, watching the heavy silver doors slide firmly shut, sealing me completely inside the quiet metallic box. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket, unlocking the screen with my thumb. It was time to stop the act. I dialed a secure number, leaving a coded voicemail for the two men I trusted most in this world. By the time I arrived at my Cherry Creek estate, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. I walked through the heavy oak doors, instantly reverting to my carefully crafted persona of a weary, disoriented old man. Derek was sitting at the mahogany dining table, his laptop open, typing furiously. When he heard my footsteps, he slammed the screen shut and pasted on his patronizing smile. He stood up, smoothing the front of his tailored suit, and ushered me toward a leather chair. Spread across the table was a thick stack of legal documents, aligned next to a silver pen. Derek placed a cup of black coffee in front of me, his eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. He spoke in a soft tone, explaining that these were just routine administrative papers. He claimed that given Natalie's health scare and my escalating stress, it would be wise to establish a temporary power of attorney. He framed it as a simple safety net, a minor formality allowing him to handle daily operations while Natalie and I focused on our recovery. I stared down at the crisp white pages. The bold letters clearly granted him absolute authority over my trust, my stock portfolio, and my real estate empire. He was trying to execute a corporate coup right in my dining room. I nodded slowly, allowing my lower lip to tremble just enough to sell it. I reached for the silver pen, my hand shaking violently. As my fingers hovered over the signature line, I deliberately let my elbow collide with the ceramic coffee cup. The hot liquid cascaded across the table, completely saturating the pristine legal documents. The paper soaked up the coffee, instantly turning the treacherous contract into a ruined mess. Derek jumped back, swearing loudly as the liquid splashed onto his suit trousers. I immediately launched into pathetic apologies, clutching my head and wailing about my failing hands. I told him my mind was terribly clouded today. Derek forced a tight smile through his gritted teeth. He told me it was perfectly fine, and he would simply have the legal department draft a fresh set of documents for tomorrow. He stormed off, leaving me alone with the ruined papers. I smiled down at the dark brown stains. I had bought myself 24 crucial hours. When midnight finally arrived, the sprawling mansion was completely silent. I slipped out through the side terrace door, bypassing the main security gates entirely. I walked a mile down the dark, winding road to a small, unassuming storage unit where I kept my old beat-up Ford truck. It was a vehicle Derek and Natalie knew nothing about, registered under a discreet holding company. I climbed into the worn leather cabin, the familiar scent of old motor oil comforting my frayed nerves. I turned the key, the heavy engine roaring to life with a satisfying growl, and steered the truck toward the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The drive up to my isolated aspen cabin was treacherous, the narrow mountain roads slick with fresh ice. I drove without the radio, my mind meticulously organizing the terrifying facts of the past 48 hours. The cabin was a rugged structure built into the side of a steep, densely wooded cliff. It was entirely off the grid, equipped with independent solar power and a secured satellite connection. As I pulled up the steep gravel driveway, I saw a black unmarked vehicle already parked near the heavy timber porch. I stepped into the freezing alpine air and walked inside. The large stone fireplace was blazing, casting a warm, flickering light across the rustic living room. Sitting at the heavy oak dining table were the two most formidable men I had ever known. Thomas Gallagher was my oldest friend and the most ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney in the state of Colorado. He had a reputation for completely dismantling his opponents in the courtroom with a cold, surgical precision. Beside him sat Victor Thorne. Victor was a top-tier cybersecurity expert and a former federal agent who had built his career hunting down international financial syndicates. He was fiercely loyal, incredibly sharp, and operated entirely in the shadows. They stood up as I entered their faces, grim and focused. There were no warm greetings or pleasantries. We all knew exactly why we were standing in this isolated cabin in the dead of night. We immediately transformed the dining room into a tactical war room. Victor unpacked a series of thick black cases, setting up an array of encrypted laptops, secure servers, and signal jammers across the wooden table. I poured us each a glass of aged whiskey, the clinking of ice against crystal, the only sound in the quiet cabin. I took a deep breath and began to lay out the horrifying reality of my situation. I started with the Sunday dinner, describing the poisoned clam chowder, Natalie's sudden violent seizure, and Derek's frantic, transparent attempts to cover up the incident. I placed the small plastic container holding the soup sample onto the table, sliding it toward Thomas. I then detailed the unannounced visit from Dr. Mercer, explaining how Derek and the corrupt physician were actively trying to build a fabricated medical history of rapid cognitive decline and dementia. Finally, I revealed the corporate lockout. I explained how Derek had installed a highly classified, heavily encrypted ledger system at Cole Commercial Properties, effectively blinding the entire executive board and granting Natalie absolute financial control. Victor's fingers flew across his keyboard as I spoke, his eyes narrowed in deep concentration. I pulled up the photograph of Natalie's hidden burner phone on my secure device and placed it in the center of the table. I read the terrifying text message aloud. Did the old man take the bait? The deadline is next Friday. Thomas leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers under his chin. His sharp eyes scanned the evidence, his mind already calculating the legal ramifications. He stated that Derek and Natalie were clearly trying to cover a massive, catastrophic financial deficit, likely utilizing the company's pristine assets as collateral for illegal high-interest loans. Victor nodded in agreement, explaining that the new encrypted ledger was designed specifically to hide unauthorized wire transfers and massive offshore hemorrhages. They were draining the lifeblood of my empire, and the people they owed money to were demanding immediate payment. I looked at the two men, feeling a surge of cold, unwavering power course through my veins. For decades, I had played the role of the generous father, the patient mentor, and the forgiving patriarch. That man was gone, buried under a mountain of lies, poison, and deceit. They had vastly underestimated the monster they had awakened. I placed my hands firmly on the table, looking Thomas and Victor directly in the eyes. I told them we were going to trace every single stolen dollar, identify the shadow creditors threatening my company, and completely dismantle Derek and Natalie's lives piece by bloody piece. It was time to hunt. The war room inside my Aspen cabin hummed with a low electric intensity. Outside, the freezing mountain wind howled against the heavy timber walls, but inside, the only sound was the rapid rhythmic clatter of Victor striking his keyboard. He had transformed my rustic oak dining table into a sophisticated digital command center. 3 black monitors glowed brightly, casting a stark blue light across his highly focused face. Thomas sat quietly near the blazing stone fireplace, sipping his whiskey and reviewing a stack of preliminary legal injunctions. We were no longer waiting for the next blow. We were actively preparing to strike back. I walked over to the table and slid my smartphone toward Victor. The screen displayed the clear, high-resolution photograph I had taken of Natalie's hidden burner phone. Victor leaned in close, his sharp eyes scanning the encrypted digits and the chilling text message waiting on the screen. He nodded slowly, a dark, confident smile touching the corners of his mouth. He explained that while the routing service masked the physical location of the device, the sender made a fatal amateur mistake. By sending a standard text message rather than using a proprietary encrypted application, the data packet had briefly pinged a local cell tower before vanishing into the shadow network. Victor connected his primary laptop to a localized signal interceptor. He began running a complex cloning algorithm using the specific timestamp and the encrypted numerical sequence from my photograph to isolate that single floating data packet. He was attempting to retroactively clone the phone's digital footprint. A thick gray progress bar appeared on his center monitor, slowly creeping forward. The tension in the room thickened with every passing second. I stood right behind his leather chair watching the digital percentage tick upward. 10%, 20%. The process was agonizingly slow, completely dependent on catching the faint, lingering echoes of the shadow routing service. While the phone cloning program chugged along in the background, Victor turned his attention to his secondary monitor. It was time to assault the main target. He brought up the login portal for the Cole Commercial Properties financial server. The screen was a sheer, imposing wall of corporate security. Derek had spared absolutely no expense when he locked me out of my own empire. Victor's fingers danced across the keys as he launched a series of aggressive diagnostic probes, actively testing the perimeter of the new encrypted ledger system. After 10 minutes of relentless digital assault, Victor finally leaned back and let out a frustrated sigh. He rubbed his tired eyes, looking up at me with a grim expression. He confirmed exactly what my terrified accountant had told me that morning. Derek had installed a military-grade compartmentalized security architecture. The external firewalls were practically impenetrable. Any brute force attempt to crack the administrative passwords would instantly trigger a catastrophic system lockdown, permanently erasing the very financial data we desperately needed to uncover. Victor stated that without Natalie's direct biometric login and her rotating master key, breaking into the consolidated ledgers from the outside was mathematically impossible. I placed my hand on Victor's shoulder and offered a cold, knowing smile. I told him he was absolutely correct. Breaking in from the outside was completely impossible, but I did not need to break into my own house. I just needed to use the back door. Both Victor and Thomas looked at me in profound confusion. I walked over to the large bay window looking out at the dark, snow-covered pines. I explained that 5 years ago, long before Derek ever entered our lives, I had commissioned a massive overhaul of the corporate mainframes. I knew that in the ruthless world of commercial real estate, information was the ultimate currency. I also knew that executive boards could be compromised, that loyalties could be bought, and that digital security was only as strong as the people guarding the passwords. I possessed the deep inherent paranoia of a man who had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. When I hired the original team of private computer architects to build our servers, I gave them one highly classified, non-negotiable directive. I paid them an exorbitant sum of quiet cash to hardwire a localized analog backdoor directly into the physical root architecture of the system. It was a phantom override, a silent failsafe that bypassed every digital firewall, every administrative protocol, and every encrypted password. It was an invisible master skeleton key, known only to me. I had never told my board of directors. I had never told my financial officers. And I certainly had never told my daughter. Victor stared at me, a look of absolute professional reverence washing over his face. He quickly cleared a secure terminal on his left monitor and brought up the raw foundational command prompt for the corporate server. I leaned over his shoulder, dictating a long, complex string of seemingly random alphanumeric characters. It was a code I had memorized half a decade ago, locked away in my mind for a catastrophic emergency exactly like this one. Victor typed the long sequence with deliberate, careful precision. He hit the enter key. The screen went completely black for 3 agonizing seconds. The silence in the cabin was so absolute I could hear the digital clock ticking on the wall. Then a sudden cascade of green text flooded the monitor. The impenetrable military-grade firewall completely vanished. We were instantly granted unfiltered root administrative access to every single hidden corner of the Cole Commercial Properties network. The vault was wide open. I instructed Victor to immediately target the compartmentalized financial ledgers Derek had desperately tried to bury. I wanted the unredacted cash flow reports, the shadow accounts, the offshore wire transfers, and the complete list of unapproved corporate loans. Victor initiated the massive data extraction. A second thick progress bar appeared on the screen, running parallel to the slow cloning process of the burner phone. The air grew incredibly thin. We stood shoulder to shoulder, our eyes glued to the dual glowing monitors. The downloading bars crept forward, representing the absolute total destruction of the lies my family had fed me. 50%, 70%, 90%. We were seconds away from exposing the massive rotting black hole at the center of my life. The burner phone clone finished first, a sharp chime echoing through the room. A massive text document instantly populated the screen, detailing months of encrypted conversations between Natalie and her shadow creditors. Before I could even read the first damning sentence, the corporate server download hit 100%. The screen flashed bright white, and a sprawling, highly detailed financial spreadsheet materialized before our eyes. The sheer scale of the theft was finally visible. The hunt had officially begun. The numbers glaring back at us painted a story of unparalleled greed, profound desperation, and total moral collapse. Derek and Natalie had sold their souls, and they had tried to sell mine right along with them. Now staring at the raw data, I felt a calm, terrifying clarity settle over me. I possessed the definitive proof I needed to completely destroy them. There would be no mercy, no hesitation, and absolutely no second chances. I would meticulously dismantle every single lie they had constructed. I would expose their breathtaking fraud to the entire world. And when they finally realized the magnitude of their spectacular failure, it would be far too late. I was taking back my empire, and I was going to bury them under the weight of their own colossal sins. The game was truly over. The deep silence of the Aspen cabin was suddenly broken by a sharp encrypted chime echoing from Victor's secondary laptop. The heavy atmosphere in the war room shifted instantly. Victor pulled away from the sprawling financial spreadsheets and opened a highly secured communication portal. Earlier that morning, Victor had dispatched a trusted, heavily vetted courier. The courier had transported the sterile plastic container holding the tainted soup residue directly to an off-the-books toxicology laboratory operating in absolute secrecy out of Boulder. The lab was run by a chemist who owed Victor his life and asked no questions. We were waiting for the chemical breakdown of the weapon my daughter intended to use against me. Victor quickly decrypted the incoming file. He dragged the document onto the central monitor so Thomas and I could read the results. The screen filled with molecular diagrams and chemical names that meant absolutely nothing to a real estate mogul. I stared at the dense paragraphs of scientific jargon, feeling a cold, heavy dread settling into the pit of my stomach. Victor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the comprehensive report. He did not speak immediately. He took a slow, deep breath, running a hand over his tired face. When he turned to look at me, his expression was grim, devoid of the triumphant energy we had shared moments ago. He pointed at the screen, highlighting a specific combination of compounds in the primary analysis. He explained that the liquid Natalie mixed into my clam chowder was not a herbal sleep aid. It was a sophisticated, incredibly lethal cocktail. The primary ingredient was a massive concentrated dose of haloperidol, a powerful antipsychotic medication typically used to treat severe schizophrenia. But the haloperidol was merely the delivery mechanism. The true horror of the poison lay in the secondary compound. The laboratory had identified a rare, entirely synthetic neuroinhibitor. Victor explained that this specific chemical variant was practically untraceable in standard hospital toxicology screens, which perfectly explained why the emergency room physicians at Denver Health had been utterly baffled by Natalie's sudden violent collapse. Thomas stood up from his leather chair near the fireplace, walking slowly toward the glowing monitors. He asked Victor to translate the data into practical terms. He wanted to know exactly what this poison was designed to do to the human body. Victor pulled up a reference file cross-referencing the neuroinhibitor with known medical databases. His voice dropped to a low whisper as he detailed the brutal mechanics of the cocktail. He stated that this particular poison was never designed to cause a sudden, painless death. It was an instrument of prolonged, systematic torture. If the mixture was carefully administered in steady microdoses over a period of exactly 30 days, the synthetic neuroinhibitor would slowly and methodically dissolve the neural pathways in the human brain. It would systematically destroy short-term memory retention, severely impair basic cognitive function, and degrade fine motor control. Victor looked me directly in the eyes and delivered the horrifying truth. The poison was chemically engineered to perfectly mimic the rapid onset of late-stage Alzheimer's disease. They were not trying to stop my heart. They were trying to erase my mind. The cruelty of their strategy washed over me like a wave of freezing water. I placed both hands firmly on the edge of the heavy oak table, gripping the wood until my knuckles turned white. My breathing became shallow and fast. I closed my eyes, visualizing the unannounced visit from Dr. Mercer just hours earlier. The pieces of their puzzle locked together with devastating clarity. Derek and Natalie were deliberately poisoning my brain, destroying my cognitive abilities so their physician could establish a legally binding medical history of dementia. They wanted to trap me inside a failing, broken mind, rendering me helpless and dependent on them. Once I was diagnosed as legally incompetent, Natalie would assume full control of my personal trust and the assets of Cole Commercial Properties. They would lock me away in a memory care facility to rot forgotten while they used my life savings to cover their criminal debts. Thomas broke the heavy silence in the cabin, his voice trembling with a rare mixture of profound shock and rising anger. He asked Victor how such a calculated, slow-acting poison had caused Natalie to experience sudden respiratory failure and violent seizures within 60 seconds of ingestion. Victor tapped the screen, pulling up the quantitative analysis section of the toxicology report. He explained that the dosage in the soup residue was astronomically high. In her desperate, frantic panic to meet the looming Friday deadline demanded by her shadow creditors, Natalie had abandoned the 30-day microdosing strategy. She had saturated the soup with a massive, highly concentrated, accelerated dose. She wanted to trigger a catastrophic neurological event immediately. But when she carelessly mixed up the bowls on the kitchen island and accidentally consumed the lethal concentration herself, the synthetic neuroinhibitor violently overloaded her nervous system. Instead of causing a slow cognitive decline, the massive overdose caused an instantaneous total neurological collapse. Her brain simply short-circuited, triggering the violent seizures and shutting down her respiratory drive. I stepped back from the glowing monitors, walking slowly toward the roaring fireplace. The intense heat radiating from the logs did absolutely nothing to warm the freezing cold, taking root in my soul. I stared into the dancing orange flames, reflecting on the 40 years of unwavering love, infinite patience, and absolute dedication I had poured into raising my only child. I had spent my life building an empire solely to ensure she would never experience hardship, poverty, or struggle. I had sacrificed my youth, my weekends, and my own personal peace to hand her the world on a silver platter. And her ultimate gratitude was a calculated chemical lobotomy. She had looked me in the eyes, smiled her beautiful, familiar smile, and tried to strip away my dignity, my memories of her mother, and my identity as a human being. The profound sadness that had initially plagued me completely evaporated, burned away by a brilliant, blinding white rage. There was no room left for grief. There was no space for paternal hesitation or soft, forgiving sentiments. The woman I had raised was completely gone, replaced by a ruthless, desperate predator who viewed my mind as a simple obstacle to be chemically destroyed. I turned away from the fire, my posture perfectly straight, my jaw set with absolute, unyielding resolve. I looked at Thomas and Victor, the two loyal wolves I had invited into this war. The financial data had exposed their massive corporate theft, and the toxicology report had unmasked their sheer, inhuman cruelty. We now possessed every single weapon required to execute a flawless, devastating counteroffensive. They had tried to erase my mind, but they were about to discover that my mind was the most dangerous, lethal weapon in this room. I instructed Thomas to begin drafting the aggressive legal injunctions immediately. I told Victor to prepare the offshore wire traces. The time for gathering evidence was over. We were going to actively destroy them. The heat of the roaring fireplace at my back stood in stark contrast to the absolute freezing reality settling over the dining room table. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitors where Victor was relentlessly attacking the encrypted financial ledgers. The digital progress bar on his primary screen had finally reached 99%. The soft rhythmic tapping of his keyboard ceased, replaced by a sudden sharp chime. The impenetrable wall of corporate security that Derek had constructed finally collapsed. The screen blinked twice before displaying a massive, highly complex spreadsheet that detailed the true financial health of coal commercial properties. This was the hidden black hole, the dark reality my son-in-law had desperately tried to bury beneath layers of military-grade encryption. Thomas leaned over the table, his sharp legal mind instantly going to work as he scanned the cascading rows of numbers. For years, Derek had aggressively cultivated the public persona of a brilliant, infallible venture capital genius. He wore bespoke suits, drove exotic imported cars, and constantly boasted about his unmatched instincts for high-yield investments. As my eyes tracked across the raw, unfiltered data illuminating the screen, that entire carefully manufactured facade shattered into a million pieces. Derek was not a financial prodigy. He was an impulsive, reckless gambler. The hidden ledgers revealed a pattern of catastrophic decisions. 6 months ago, right around the time Natalie supposedly began experiencing her severe executive burnout, Derek had executed a massive unauthorized withdrawal. He had bypassed standard corporate oversight and completely drained $25 million from a shadow holding account. But he did not invest that staggering sum in stable commercial real estate or secure municipal bonds. Driven by sheer arrogance and a desperate desire to prove his fabricated genius, Derek had funneled the entire $25 million into a highly volatile, unregulated cryptocurrency derivative market. He had bet everything on a speculative digital asset, chasing a miraculous overnight fortune to inflate his own ego. The ledger showed the exact date of his catastrophic failure. A sudden, brutal flash crash in the crypto markets had wiped out his entire position in less than 4 hours. The $25 million had completely evaporated into the digital ether, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a terrifying, unpayable void. I stared at the red numbers highlighting the total loss, feeling a strange mixture of disgust and dark vindication. My brilliant son-in-law was nothing more than a pathetic, desperate fraud who had gambled away a fortune and lost. But the true horror of the situation was not simply the loss of the money. It was the terrifying origin of the funds. I asked Victor to trace the initial deposit to find out exactly where that $25 million had come from, before Derek so foolishly lost it. Victor's fingers danced across the keyboard, executing a rapid series of offshore wire traces. He bypassed dummy corporations and shell accounts, methodically following the digital breadcrumbs back to the absolute source. The trail finally ended at a private equity firm based out of Miami, Florida. The company name on the screen looked generic and completely unassuming, but Thomas immediately went pale. He practically choked on his aged whiskey, staring at the monitor with wide, terrified eyes. Thomas explained that the Miami firm was not a legitimate lending institution. It was a well-known, highly sophisticated money laundering front operating on behalf of a notoriously violent international cartel. They specialized in moving massive amounts of illicit cash through clean corporate channels, offering short-term, high-interest loans to desperate executives who could not secure traditional banking. Derek had not borrowed money from a bank. He had borrowed $25 million from ruthless, bloodthirsty criminals, and he had used my company's infrastructure to process the illicit transaction. The pieces of their desperate homicidal puzzle finally slammed together with terrifying clarity. I reached for my smartphone, bringing up the photograph of Natalie's hidden burner phone. The chilling text message practically burned through the screen. Did the old man take the bait? The deadline is next Friday. The encrypted number did not belong to a corporate rival or a greedy blackmailer. The message was sent directly by the cartel. Derek had lost their money, and they were demanding immediate full repayment. They did not care about the unpredictable crypto crash, and they certainly did not care about his fabricated financial genius. They wanted their $25 million, and if they did not get it by next Friday, Derek was a dead man. The absolute panic, the frantic pacing in the hospital, the elaborate lie about the herbal sleep aid, it all finally made perfect, sickening sense. Derek and Natalie were utterly trapped. They had absolutely no way to legally replace the missing funds. Their only viable exit strategy, their only chance of surviving the wrath of a heavily armed international cartel, was to secure my massive personal trust fund. But they could not access my money while I was alive and legally competent. That was precisely why they introduced the lethal synthetic neuroinhibitor. That was exactly why they brought in the corrupt private physician to build a documented history of severe dementia. They needed to rapidly declare me mentally unfit, force me into a locked memory care facility, and liquidate my lifelong assets to pay off their blood debt. When the slow poisoning method proved far too slow for the cartel's strict Friday deadline, a panicked Natalie had attempted to deliver a massive fatal dose directly into my soup. She was entirely willing to murder her own father in cold blood just to save her pathetic gambling husband from the violent consequences of his own monumental stupidity. She had actively chosen the life of a fraud over the father who had given her absolutely everything. I stood in the quiet mountain cabin, letting the absolute magnitude of her betrayal settle deep into my tired bones. The chilling realization that my daughter viewed my life as nothing more than a convenient bargaining chip to appease a drug cartel erased any lingering trace of paternal hesitation. I looked at Victor and Thomas, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that echoed slightly in the rustic room. I told them we were not going to run. We were not going to hide, and we were certainly not going to warn the federal authorities. The authorities would immediately freeze my assets and drag my beautiful company through a decade of public humiliating litigation. Instead, we were going to use the cartel's own brutal deadline against them. We were going to weave a brilliant, inescapable trap so perfectly disguised that Derek and Natalie would willingly walk right into it, completely unaware that their ultimate executioner was the very man they had tried to bury. I calmly instructed Thomas to carefully prepare the final legal maneuvers. I told Victor to secure the digital traps. They had foolishly brought a cartel to my own front doorstep, and I was going to let the wolves devour them whole. The financial abyss was waiting for them, and I was completely ready to push them straight in. Victor did not stop typing. His fingers moved with a frantic, relentless rhythm across the illuminated keyboard, the mechanical clatter filling the room. The dark mountain cabin felt heavy with the weight of the secrets we had just unearthed, but the investigation was far from over. The initial $25 million cryptocurrency loss was merely the surface of the wound. A ruthless international cartel operating out of a sleek Miami high-rise does not simply wire a massive fortune to a struggling executive based on a firm handshake and a promising business proposal. Criminal syndicates of that magnitude demand ironclad guarantees. They demand blood or tangible assets. I leaned over the heavy wooden table, watching the dual monitors closely. I instructed Victor to trace the origination documents for the loan. I desperately needed to see the exact paperwork Derek had submitted to the private equity front to secure that level of catastrophic funding. Thomas stood silently behind me, his sharp legal instincts practically humming with anticipation. We watched as Victor effortlessly bypassed another layer of encrypted corporate security, digging into a hidden vault of digitized legal contracts that Derek had buried deep within the network. A sprawling multi-page contract flooded the center screen in bright white text. The document was dense with complex financial terminology and aggressive legal clauses, but the core function was immediately clear to anyone in my line of work. It was a heavily collateralized debt obligation. Derek had not secured the massive loan on the strength of his own hollow reputation. He had explicitly pledged physical assets. Victor zoomed in on the attached property deeds, and all the air completely vanished from my lungs. The documents displayed the pristine, undeniable architectural blueprints of 4 distinct buildings. They were the absolute crown jewels of Cole Commercial Properties. The towering glass skyscraper in downtown Denver, the sprawling commercial plaza in Chicago, the luxury residential high-rise in Austin, and the massive corporate campus in Seattle. These 4 properties alone represented the beating heart of my life's work, generating the vast majority of our annual corporate revenue. Derek had packaged them together, wrapped them in a neat digital bow, and handed the absolute legal rights over to a cartel money laundering front. I stared at the signature line at the bottom of the page. My name was signed in a bold, sweeping script. It was a flawless forgery. Thomas leaned closer to the glowing monitor, his eyes narrowing sharply as he analyzed the forged signature. He pointed out the slight, almost invisible hesitation in the ink flow, the microscopic inconsistencies that only a trained forensic eye would ever catch. But to a corrupt Miami equity firm eager to secure prime real estate, the signature was more than sufficient. Natalie had undoubtedly provided Derek with decades of my personal documents to study copy and meticulously trace. They had worked together in the quiet hours of the night, perfectly replicating the signature I had spent 40 years using to build an empire just so they could tear it all down. The contract was brutally simple. If the $25 million principal, along with an astronomical interest rate, was not repaid in full by the upcoming Friday deadline, the Miami firm would immediately execute a hostile takeover. Through a complex web of anonymous offshore shell companies, the cartel would seize total ownership of the 4 skyscrapers. They would legally bypass all corporate oversight and strip the priceless assets completely bare. The immediate loss of those 4 properties would send Cole Commercial Properties into an irreversible death spiral. The company would face immediate bankruptcy. Hundreds of loyal, hardworking employees would be thrown out onto the street, and my life's legacy would be completely annihilated. But the financial ruin of my corporation was entirely secondary to the deep personal devastation washing over me. I finally understood the terrifying absolute scope of Natalie's motivation. When Derek lost the $25 million in the cryptocurrency flash crash, absolute panic must have consumed their luxurious penthouse. They were staring straight down the barrel of a loaded gun. The cartel wanted their money, and they would brutally murder Derek to send a violent message. But murder would not stop the property seizure. The cartel would still claim the skyscrapers, the fraudulent loan would be exposed, the forged signatures would be uncovered by federal investigators, and Natalie would face decades in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate fraud. She had to find a way to quietly liquidate corporate assets to pay off the cartel without raising any red flags or triggering an audit from the board of directors. She simply could not do that while I was sitting at the head of the table. She needed absolute, unchecked dictatorial control over the entire corporate treasury. But more importantly, she needed a distraction large enough to cover the massive financial hemorrhage she was about to cause. That was the sick, twisted brilliance behind the synthetic neuroinhibitor and Dr. Mercer. If I suffered a sudden, tragic medical emergency, if my mind deteriorated rapidly into a state of severe dementia, the entire corporate board would naturally panic. The company would be thrown into profound emotional turmoil. In the midst of that tragic chaos, Natalie would step forward as the grieving, dutiful daughter. Armed with a fabricated medical diagnosis and an emergency power of attorney, she would be universally granted absolute authority to manage my personal wealth and the company accounts. She could secretly wire the $25 million to the Miami firm, saving her pathetic husband from a cartel bullet. She would then hide the massive loss under the guise of my failing cognitive health, blaming the missing funds on the erratic financial decisions of an old man losing his mind. I would be locked away in a high-security memory care facility, completely unable to defend my own reputation or expose their horrifying crimes. She chose her luxurious lifestyle over my sanity. She chose her cowardly husband over her own father. To preserve her status, her exotic cars, her sprawling penthouse, and her personal freedom, Natalie willfully decided that my brain needed to be chemically dismantled. The betrayal was so absolute, so fundamentally evil, that it transcended mere anger. It was a cold, suffocating darkness that settled deeply into the marrow of my bones. I stood in the silent, freezing mountain cabin staring blindly at the digital monitors. The thick logs in the stone fireplace crackled and hissed, sending brief showers of orange sparks up into the dark chimney. The silence stretched for a long, heavy moment, as Thomas and Victor simply watched me waiting patiently for my command. They knew the emotional magnitude of what we had just uncovered. They knew I was standing at the absolute precipice of a devastating familial war. I slowly reached out and closed the laptop screen, plunging the room into a shadowy twilight. I slowly turned to face the two men who had sworn to protect my empire. I told them that the grieving father was officially dead. I instructed them to prepare the final devastating strike. The hunt was now a cold, calculated, and absolutely ruthless execution. The cabin remained wrapped in a dense, suffocating silence following my declaration of war. Thomas began meticulously organizing his legal briefs, his pen scratching quietly against the heavy parchment. I walked back toward the roaring fireplace, seeking a momentary reprieve from the chilling revelations of the night. But the reprieve never came. A low, synthetic beep resonated from Victor's central monitor. The sound cut through the quiet room like a finely sharpened blade. I turned slowly, watching Victor type a rapid sequence of commands. He had not simply cloned the text messages and call logs from my daughter's hidden burner phone. He had deployed a deep recovery algorithm searching for fragmented data buried deep within the device's volatile memory. Victor looked up, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, concentrated focus. He explained that the cartel was not the only entity Natalie was communicating with on that untraceable network. She had established a secondary, highly encrypted channel. Victor's software had successfully isolated a deleted audio file. It was a fragmented voicemail erased from the phone but still lingering as phantom data in the root directory. I stepped away from the warmth of the hearth and approached the heavy oak table. Thomas set his pen down, his eyes locked on the glowing screen. Victor initiated the audio restoration protocol. A complex green waveform appeared on his monitor, fluctuating wildly as the software scrubbed away the digital static and background interference. He warned me that the audio might be difficult to hear, but the voices would be unmistakable. I nodded silently, bracing myself for another blow. Victor pressed the playback key. A sharp hiss of static filled the room, followed by the clear, undeniable sound of my daughter's voice. Her tone was completely devoid of the sweet, loving warmth she had projected in my hospital room. It was cold, calculating, and dripping with an impatient, venomous arrogance. She was leaving a direct message for Dr. Mercer. Listening to her speak in the shadows of my own mountain cabin felt like an absolute violation of my soul. Every word she uttered was a deliberate strike against my sanity, a calculated move to erase my existence. Natalie's voice echoed through the rustic room, outlining the darkest corners of her homicidal strategy. She sharply reprimanded the corrupt physician, demanding to know why the chemical degradation was taking so long. She explicitly detailed her frustration with the synthetic neuroinhibitor. She complained that my mind was proving far too resilient, that the daily microdoses were not deteriorating my cognitive functions fast enough to meet the looming Friday deadline set by the cartel. Her voice remained perfectly steady as she openly discussed the chemical destruction of my brain. She told Dr. Mercer that they needed to escalate the dosage immediately. She demanded a faster, more aggressive chemical breakdown, insisting that my mental capacity needed to collapse within the next 48 hours. Hearing my only child casually demand the total destruction of my intellect was a profound, agonizing trauma. It was a level of betrayal that defied all human comprehension. She was orchestrating my intellectual execution with the precise, detached efficiency of a corporate manager ordering office supplies. But the audio recording did not stop with the poisoning directive. Natalie methodically laid out the sequential phases of her horrifying master plan. She instructed Dr. Mercer to prepare the final medical evaluation. She needed a binding, legally unassailable document, officially declaring me entirely incompetent. She emphasized that the medical diagnosis had to be absolutely flawless, immune to any future legal scrutiny or independent medical review. Once the corrupt physician provided the fabricated documentation of severe late-stage dementia, the next phase of her trap would instantly spring closed. Natalie detailed her specific arrangements with a highly exclusive, heavily guarded memory care facility located on the remote outskirts of the state. She described the facility as a permanent, isolated fortress. She had already selected a locked, windowless room where I would be confined, heavily medicated, and entirely cut off from the outside world. I would be a ghost, a forgotten old man trapped in a chemical haze while she assumed absolute dictatorial control over my entire life. The sheer malice in her plan was breathtaking, but her ultimate objective was purely financial. Natalie's voice grew tight with desperate anticipation as she explained the final critical mechanism of her scapegoat operation. She needed the medical declaration of dementia to activate the emergency power of attorney. She explicitly stated that Cole Commercial Properties was already leveraged to the absolute limit. Derek had completely drained the corporate shadow accounts and secretly mortgaged the 4 skyscrapers. They had absolutely no corporate funds left to steal. Their only remaining avenue for salvation was my private, untouched, personal trust fund. Natalie detailed the exact balance of my private accounts, correctly noting the $45 million sitting safely in a secure, diversified portfolio. It was the vast, untouchable fortune I had built over 40 years, the money I had specifically set aside to secure the future of our family for generations to come. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper as she revealed the grand finale of her treacherous design. She explained to Dr. Mercer exactly how she intended to explain the sudden, massive disappearance of my $45 million fortune. She was going to use my chemically induced dementia as the perfect, unassailable alibi. Once she drained my personal accounts and wired the money to the Miami cartel to save her husband, she would fabricate a trail of disastrous, erratic financial investments. She would publicly lament the tragic decline of her brilliant father, explaining to the board of directors and the federal authorities that my deteriorating mind had led me to make catastrophic financial blunders in my final days of lucidity. She was going to blame the entire $45 million loss on a crazy, confused old man. I would be the ultimate scapegoat, the tragic figure who squandered a massive fortune in a haze of senility, completely shielding her and Derek from any criminal liability. The voicemail concluded with her final sickening promise to the corrupt doctor. Once the cartel was fully paid and my reputation was completely destroyed, she and Derek were leaving the country. She spoke enthusiastically about a secured villa in Switzerland, a luxurious, untouchable sanctuary where they would live out their days on the remnants of my stolen wealth. She promised Dr. Mercer a substantial final payment for his medical perjury, instructing him to finalize the paperwork before Monday morning. The recording ended with a sharp click, leaving the cabin engulfed in an oppressive, ringing silence. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer evil of her master plan wash over me. She was not just trying to steal my money. She was trying to completely obliterate my legacy, my dignity, and my freedom solely to finance her luxurious escape to a Swiss haven. Thomas and Victor stared at me, their faces pale, clearly horrified by my daughter's depravity. I turned to Victor, my voice steady, empty of any residual paternal mercy. I told him to archive the audio. We were going to trap them in their cage. I watched Victor securely encrypt the audio file, sealing the horrific evidence of my daughter's betrayal into a digital vault. The fire had burned down to glowing embers by the time the first light of dawn crept over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. It was Thursday morning. The cartel's absolute deadline was less than 24 hours away. Derek and Natalie were undoubtedly waking up in their luxurious penthouse, drowning in panic, frantically praying that their slow-acting poison had finally eroded my mind enough to execute their ultimate theft. They believed they were playing a high-stakes game of chess, unaware that I had just flipped the entire board. I turned to Thomas, who was already drafting the necessary legal instruments to secure my assets. I told him we were not going to involve federal law enforcement, nor were we going to let the Miami private equity firm seize my 4 pristine skyscrapers. I had spent 40 years building coal commercial properties with my own 2 hands, and I absolutely refused to surrender my life's work to a syndicate of ruthless criminals because of my son-in-law's pathetic gambling addiction. I instructed Thomas to initiate an immediate liquidation protocol. We were going to bypass the corporate bureaucracy entirely. I authorized him to access my secure personal trust, the exact fund Natalie planned to drain, and liquidate $25 million in liquid capital. Thomas stopped typing, his sharp eyes widening in profound shock. He asked me if I was seriously intending to pay off the massive debt accumulated by the very people actively trying to destroy my mind. I looked at my oldest friend, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. I explained that I was not paying off their debt. I was purchasing it. By wiring the $25 million directly to the Miami firm through a secure intermediary channel, I would completely satisfy the cartel's financial demand. In exchange for the immediate untraceable payment, my legal team would quietly acquire the rights to the fraudulent loan and take direct possession of the forged collateral deeds. The cartel would get their money and vanish back into the shadows entirely satisfied. They would release their violent grip on Derek, leaving him completely exposed. More importantly, it meant that Derek and Natalie would no longer owe $25 million to a Miami syndicate. They would owe $25 million directly to me. Thomas absorbed the sheer ruthless brilliance of the strategy. A slow smile spread across his weathered face as he realized the magnitude of the trap we were constructing. He immediately opened a secure communication line with his most trusted offshore financial brokers. For the next several hours, the isolated cabin transformed into a high-speed trading floor. I authorized the withdrawal from my primary trust, watching as decades of disciplined investing were instantly converted into raw, liquid cash. Victor used his deep web connections to establish an encrypted, untraceable routing channel directly to the Miami private equity firm. We moved with surgical precision, operating entirely outside the boundaries of standard banking regulations, to ensure Derek and Natalie remained completely blind to our maneuvers. By early Thursday afternoon, the monumental transaction was finalized. The screen on Victor's central monitor flashed a bright, solid green confirmation. $25 million had successfully landed in the cartel's shadow accounts. Within minutes, Thomas received an encrypted digital packet containing the original loan documents, the predatory interest agreements, and the forged property deeds bearing my meticulously copied signature. The Miami syndicate had relinquished their claim. My 4 skyscrapers were safe from hostile seizure. The physical threat of cartel violence had been completely neutralized, entirely removed from the equation. Derek was no longer a dead man walking. He was something far worse. He was a man who falsely believed he was about to win. I stared at the digital confirmation of the transfer, feeling a cold, heavy satisfaction settle in my chest. My daughter and her husband had built their entire homicidal master plan around the desperate, frantic need to satisfy the cartel before Friday morning. By eliminating that external threat, I had effectively removed their only excuse, stripping away the panic and leaving absolutely nothing but their raw, unfiltered greed. They were no longer fighting for their lives. They were simply attempting to rob an old man they believed was broken and helpless. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the snow-covered pines outside the window, I knew it was time to initiate the final phase of the operation. I instructed Victor to pack his equipment and wipe the network drives clean. Thomas gathered the devastating legal files, locking them securely inside his leather briefcase. I left the mountain sanctuary and drove my Ford truck down the treacherous roads toward Denver. I returned to my Cherry Creek estate just as the sun dipped below the horizon, cloaking the massive stone mansion in deep, imposing shadows. The house was empty and quiet. I walked into my expansive, wood-paneled study and sat behind my mahogany desk. I took a few minutes to steady my breathing, deliberately, cultivating a profound sense of physical and mental exhaustion. I slumped my shoulders, allowed my hands to tremble slightly, and let a hollow, confused emptiness fill my eyes. I picked up the heavy brass telephone on my desk and dialed the direct number to Derek and Natalie's penthouse. The phone rang only twice before Natalie answered, her voice tight with thinly veiled anxiety. I did not speak immediately. I let out a long, ragged sigh, allowing a pathetic, trembling weakness to bleed into my vocal cords. I called her name, my voice sounding incredibly frail and disoriented. I told her that my mind felt clouded, that the heavy fog Dr. Mercer warned us about had finally settled over me. I confessed that I was struggling to remember simple details, that the sheer complexity of running coal commercial properties was suddenly far too overwhelming for my failing brain. I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath on the other end of the line. Natalie hastily covered the receiver, but I could hear the muffled, frantic excitement in her voice as she whispered to Derek. She returned to the call, her tone dripping with a sickening, fabricated sweetness. She told me to stay perfectly calm, assuring me that she was there to help and protect me. I played my role with flawless, agonizing precision. I told her that she and Derek were absolutely right. I admitted that I was no longer capable of protecting the empire I had built. I asked them to come to the Cherry Creek mansion immediately. I told them to bring the final corporate transition papers and the complete power of attorney documents. I promised them that I was finally ready to sign everything over, to surrender total control of my life and my fortune into their capable hands. Natalie practically wept with feigned relief, promising they would be there within the hour. I placed the brass receiver gently back onto the cradle. The trap was perfectly set, the bait was taken, and the guillotine was raised high. The heavy oak doors of the Cherry Creek mansion swung open less than 40 minutes later. I remained seated behind my massive mahogany desk, my head bowed, my hands resting limply on the polished wood. I heard the click of Natalie's designer heels echoing across the marble foyer, with the heavier footsteps of Derek and a third man. They never knocked. They pushed the doors open, stepping into the dimly lit room with the arrogant swagger of conquerors claiming a fallen kingdom. Natalie held a chilled bottle of vintage champagne in one hand and crystal flutes in the other. Derek carried a thick black leather briefcase, his chest puffed out with victorious pride. Behind them was Dr. Mercer clutching a black medical bag. They wore expressions of deep sorrow, but their eyes betrayed them completely. Their pupils were dilated with the thrill of absolute greed. They looked exactly like a pack of starving hyenas circling a wounded, dying lion, eagerly waiting for the beast to draw its final breath so they could feast on the remains. Natalie rushed to my side, placing the champagne on a side table. She knelt beside my chair, placing a cold hand over my own. She adopted a sickeningly sweet voice, asking how I was feeling and cooing about how brave I was being. I did not look at her. I kept my gaze fixed emptily on the surface of the desk, playing the part of a broken shell of a man. Dr. Mercer stepped forward, assuming his role in their horrific theatrical production. He opened his medical bag and pulled out a small penlight, shining the harsh beam directly into my eyes. I let my pupils react sluggishly, blinking in slow, confused intervals. He checked my pulse, his fingers pressing against my wrist with clinical detachment. He sighed heavily, looking over at Natalie and Derek with a grave, practiced expression. He stated in a soft, mournful tone that the cognitive decline was accelerating far more rapidly than he had initially anticipated. He declared that my neurological pathways were severely compromised, rendering me entirely incapable of making rational decisions regarding my health or my finances. It was a flawless, chilling performance of medical perjury. He was officially sealing my fate, providing the exact legal justification Natalie needed to execute her hostile takeover. Natalie wiped a dry, invisible tear from her cheek and nodded bravely. She told the corrupt physician that they were prepared to bear this terrible burden. She claimed that taking control of coal commercial properties and my personal trust was the only way to protect my legacy from my own failing mind. Derek stood near the fireplace, attempting to look solemn, but a smug, predatory smirk kept twitching at the corners of his mouth. He unlatched the heavy brass clasps of his black leather briefcase. The sharp metallic snaps echoed loudly in the quiet study, signaling the beginning of the end. He pulled out a thick stack of pristine legal documents, the exact same papers I had deliberately ruined with coffee just 24 hours prior. Derek walked over to my mahogany desk and spread the documents out with meticulous care. He aligned the pages perfectly, making sure the signature lines were clearly visible. The bold heading at the top of the primary document read, "Durable Power of Attorney." Below it were the transfer agreements for my absolute control over the corporate board, the holding companies, and my untouched $45 million personal trust fund. Natalie stepped up beside her husband, her eyes locked hungrily on the blank signature lines. She reached over and popped the cork on the champagne bottle. The festive sound was a grotesque insult in the heavy, somber atmosphere they were attempting to maintain. She poured the bubbling liquid into the crystal flutes, preparing to celebrate my complete financial execution the moment the ink dried on the paper. Derek reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy gold fountain pen. He uncapped it with a smooth, practiced motion and leaned over the desk. He placed the pen gently into my trembling right hand, his fingers lingering over mine to guide them toward the waiting document. He looked down at me, his eyes practically burning with desperate homicidal anticipation. He spoke in a low, soothing voice dripping with venomous sincerity. He told me that this was for my own good, Dad. He promised that they would take care of absolutely everything, that I would never have to worry about the stress of the company or my finances ever again. They just needed my signature to make all the pain go away. I stared down at the gold pen resting loosely in my fingers. I looked at the stark black ink defining the boundaries of my total surrender. The room was silent, pregnant with the weight of their impending victory. Dr. Mercer stood near the door, arms crossed, waiting to witness and notarize the final destruction of my autonomy. Natalie held 2 champagne flutes, her breath catching in her throat, as she watched my hand hover over the dotted line. Derek leaned closer, his predatory shadow falling directly across my face. They thought I was beaten. They believed their chemical neuroinhibitor had successfully dissolved my intellect, rendering me a compliant, mindless puppet in their desperate scheme to appease a Miami drug cartel. They were absolutely certain that the old foolish patriarch was finally stepping aside. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. Then I stopped trembling. The violent, erratic shaking in my right hand vanished instantly. I gripped the heavy gold fountain pen with complete absolute stability. I slowly raised my head, lifting my gaze from the legal documents to look directly into Derek's eyes. The hollow, confused emptiness completely drained from my expression, instantly replaced by a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. Derek's smug smile faltered, a sudden flicker of genuine confusion, sparking in his irises as he registered the sudden dramatic shift in my posture. I did not say a word. I simply dropped his expensive gold pen onto the mahogany desk. The heavy metal clattered loudly against the polished wood, rolling away from the unsigned documents. I pushed my chair back and stood up perfectly straight. I did not use the desk for support. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, projecting the unwavering authority of a man who had commanded boardrooms for 4 decades. The sudden imposing transformation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Natalie gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, the champagne splashing over the rims of the crystal flutes. Dr. Mercer stiffened, his professional facade cracking instantly. Derek stared at me, his jaw dropping open in sheer, unadulterated horror. They were no longer looking at a dying lion. They were staring at a monster who had just locked the cage. I ignored the paralyzing shock radiating from the 3 traitors. I slowly reached across the mahogany desk and picked up a small black remote control resting near my brass telephone. I pointed the device toward the far wall of the study and firmly pressed the power button. The massive flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace instantly hummed to life. The massive screen flickered for a fraction of a second before displaying a crystal-clear video feed. The camera was perfectly positioned inside a sunlit boardroom that overlooked the blue waters of the Miami coastline. Sitting at the head of a massive glass conference table was my oldest friend and attorney, Thomas Gallagher. He looked perfectly at ease, projecting an aura of cold, calculated authority. Across from him sat three men in immaculate tailored suits. They did not look like standard corporate bankers. They possessed a sharp, predatory stillness, their postures rigid, and their eyes devoid of any warmth. Derek let out a sharp, choked gasp, stumbling backward until his spine collided with the heavy wooden bookshelves. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He instantly recognized the sleek Miami boardroom, and he absolutely recognized the three dangerous men sitting across from my attorney. Natalie stared at the screen in profound confusion, unable to comprehend why her father was broadcasting a live meeting from Florida instead of signing away his fortune. On the screen, Thomas reached down and unlatched a heavy reinforced briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of finalized legal contracts and slid them smoothly across the polished glass table. The lead cartel operative, a man with a distinct scar running along his jawline, picked up the documents and inspected them with meticulous care. He pulled a silver pen from his pocket and signed his name with a swift, decisive motion. He then slid a separate, highly secured leather folder back across the table toward Thomas. Thomas opened the folder briefly, checking the contents to ensure the forged property deeds and the predatory loan agreements were all accounted for. Finding everything in perfect order, Thomas closed the folder, stood up, and extended his hand. The cartel operative stood and met his grip, shaking his hand firmly to seal the transaction. Thomas turned his head, looking directly into the hidden camera lens, and offered a single sharp nod of confirmation. The massive transaction was officially complete. I pressed the power button on the small black remote control, and the television screen instantly went black, plunging the quiet study back into an oppressive, suffocating silence. Dr. Mercer was pressed flat against the heavy oak door, his medical bag clutched tightly to his chest, his eyes darting frantically around the room as he desperately searched for an avenue of escape. He finally realized he had walked directly into a catastrophic trap, and his lucrative Swiss payoff was rapidly evaporating. Natalie was trembling violently, the two crystal champagne flutes slipping from her numb fingers. They shattered against the polished hardwood floor, sending a spray of glass and bubbling liquid across the expensive Persian rug. She looked at me, her mouth opening and closing silently, entirely unable to articulate the sheer magnitude of her confusion and terror. But Derek understood perfectly. He was completely paralyzed, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes wide with a primal, suffocating dread. He knew exactly what that handshake in Miami meant, and he knew that his elaborate homicidal master plan had just been brutally dismantled. I placed the black remote control back onto my dark mahogany desk and took a slow, measured step toward my son-in-law. My posture remained perfectly straight, my expression an unyielding mask of cold, calculated fury. I spoke in a smooth, resonant voice, completely stripping away the pathetic weakness I had projected just moments before. Every single syllable I spoke was a deliberate, brutal strike against his shattering ego. I looked dead into his terrified eyes and told him that I knew absolutely everything. I told him about the $25 million he had gambled away in the cryptocurrency market. I told him about the hidden offshore ledgers, the desperate cartel loan, and the pristine corporate skyscrapers he had illegally pledged as collateral using my forged signature. Derek tried to speak, tried to formulate some pathetic, groveling excuse, but his dry vocal cords completely failed him. He simply stood there, a completely hollow, broken shell of a man, drowning in the terrifying reality of his own colossal failure. I took another step forward, entirely closing the physical distance between us, until I was standing mere inches from his trembling face. I lowered my voice to a dangerous, icy whisper, ensuring that every word echoed with absolute, undeniable authority. I told him that I did not call the federal authorities. I did not contact the police, and I did not trigger a massive corporate audit that would have dragged my company through a decade of public litigation. Instead, I had utilized the very financial resources he had desperately sought to steal. I explained that I had just authorized a massive transfer from my untouched personal trust fund. I used my own $45 million fortune to purchase his illicit debt directly from the Miami syndicate. I told him that the $25 million he owed the cartel had just been paid in absolute full. They had surrendered the forged property deeds, relinquished all claims against Cole commercial properties, and walked away. The violent, bloodthirsty men who had threatened to end his life were out of the picture. The external threat was completely gone. Derek's chest heaved as he desperately tried to drag air into his failing lungs. A fleeting, pathetic glimmer of hope briefly flashed across his panicked eyes. For a fraction of a second, his arrogant, deeply flawed mind believed that I had stepped in to save him, that I had acted as the generous, forgiving patriarch to clean up his massive, catastrophic mess. He foolishly believed that the nightmare was over. I watched that pathetic spark of hope ignite, and then I systematically crushed it into absolute oblivion. I leaned in close, the pure, unadulterated venom in my voice slicing through the quiet room. I told him that the cartel was indeed gone, but their absence did not mean he was free. It meant something far worse. It meant that I had legally assumed the full weight of his catastrophic financial obligations. The trap finally snapped closed with a deafening crack. I explained the new, horrifying reality of his existence. I told him that I was now his sole absolute creditor. I owned the heavily collateralized debt he had recklessly signed. I held the forged documents that proved his massive criminal fraud. I owned the rights to his luxurious penthouse, his expensive cars, and every single asset he falsely believed he possessed. More importantly, I owned his physical freedom. With a single telephone call, I could hand the forged documents over to the district attorney, ensuring he spent the rest of his natural life rotting inside a federal penitentiary. He had traded a swift execution by a cartel for a slow, methodical destruction orchestrated by his own father-in-law. I stepped back, my eyes locking onto his terrified, weeping face. I raised my hand, pointing a single, steady finger directly at his chest. I delivered my final, devastating ultimatum. I told him that he had exactly 10 seconds to tell me why I should not crush him into absolute dust. Derek's legs simply ceased to function. The crushing gravity of my words slammed into him like a physical blow, driving him straight down to the polished hardwood floor. He collapsed onto his knees, his hands clutching desperately at his chest as he began to hyperventilate. Short, ragged gasps of air tore through his throat, echoing loudly in the suffocating silence of the study. He stared up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes representing a pathetic portrait of absolute defeat. The arrogant corporate predator who had so eagerly forged my signature and gambled with my legacy was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, broken shell of a man, drowning in the inescapable realization that I held his entire existence in the palm of my hand. He opened his mouth to beg, to offer some desperate plea for mercy, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by fear. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, unable to breathe, unable to run, and entirely unable to hide. Dr. Mercer watched Derek crumble, and the corrupt physician's self-preservation instinct finally overrode his paralyzing shock. He clutched his black medical bag tightly against his chest, his eyes darting wildly. He spun on his heels, abandoning his wealthy co-conspirators without a single ounce of hesitation, and lunged toward the heavy oak doors of the study. He was desperate to escape the blast radius of their colossal failure, frantically hoping to vanish into the Denver night before the full scope of his medical perjury was exposed. He reached out to grab the brass handle, his face slick with a cold sweat. Before his trembling fingers could make contact, the massive double doors swung open with a resounding heavy thud. Dr. Mercer stumbled backward, letting out a sharp cry of alarm. Standing perfectly framed in the doorway was Victor. His expression was a mask of cold, uncompromising granite. He did not step aside. Instead, he stepped into the room, flanked immediately by three imposing men wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation emblazoned across their backs. The federal agents moved with a swift, practiced efficiency, their presence instantly draining the last remaining drops of oxygen from the room. Dr. Mercer dropped his medical bag. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, spilling a handful of prescription pads and glass vials across the Persian rug. Natalie let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She looked at the federal agents, then at her broken husband on the floor, and finally at me. In a matter of seconds, her calculating, homicidal mind attempted a desperate, sickening pivot. She threw herself onto her knees, crawling across the Persian rug until she was weeping at my feet. She grabbed the hem of my trousers, her face buried in her hands, violently sobbing. She wailed that she had no idea what Derek was doing. She shrieked that her husband had manipulated her, that he had forced her to go along with the medical evaluations, that she was merely a terrified victim trying to survive a violently abusive marriage. It was an Oscar-worthy performance of absolute fabricated despair. I looked down at the woman I had raised, feeling an icy, desolate void where my paternal love used to reside. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a thick, folded stack of documents. I threw them down, letting them scatter violently across the floor right in front of her weeping face. The pages fanned out, displaying the comprehensive toxicological report from the private laboratory. The scattered documents revealed the precise laboratory analysis, the meticulously printed transcripts from her hidden burner phone, and a small digital drive containing the restored audio files of her ordering my chemical execution. Natalie's hysterical sobbing stopped instantly. Her tear-filled eyes locked onto the header. I stepped back, physically separating myself from her desperate grasp. I spoke in a voice so cold it practically froze the air between us. I told her that I knew about the poison. I watched the blood completely drain from her cheeks as I explained that I had switched the dinner plates. I told her that the gentle, soothing herbal sleep aid she had so lovingly prepared for me was nothing more than a lethal synthetic neuroinhibitor designed to rot my brain. I leaned down, making sure she could see the absolute unforgiving finality in my eyes. I told her that she had willingly tried to bury her own father alive in a chemical grave just to save a cowardly gambler from a cartel bullet. The lead federal agent stepped past Victor, his eyes locking onto the two men in the room. He did not look at Natalie. He directly approached Derek. Derek was still kneeling on the floor in a state of catatonic shock. The agent grabbed Derek by the shoulder, hauling him roughly to his feet, and forcefully twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping closed echoed like a gunshot. The agent read Derek his rights, officially placing him under arrest for massive federal wire fraud, international embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit corporate theft. Derek did not resist. He simply hung his head, his tears falling silently onto the polished wood. The second and third agents moved seamlessly toward Dr. Mercer. The corrupt physician raised his hands in trembling surrender, stammering that he was simply following orders, that he was a respected medical professional who had been blackmailed. The agents ignored his pathetic pleas. They shoved him against the mahogany wall, snapping the heavy steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. They loudly recited his federal charges, officially arresting him for severe medical fraud, criminal negligence, and conspiracy to commit murder. The doctor's knees buckled, his previously arrogant, wealthy facade completely shattered by the terrifying reality of spending the rest of his natural life behind the bleak concrete walls of a cold federal penitentiary. The agents marched Derek and Dr. Mercer out of the study, dragging them down the long hallway toward the waiting black tactical vehicles. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving only Victor, myself, and my daughter in the sprawling, silent room. Natalie remained on the floor, her hands trembling, as she stared at the damning evidence. She looked up at me, a sudden desperate spark of hope flickering in her eyes. She noticed that the federal agents had not placed her in handcuffs. She falsely believed my paternal instinct prevailed, that I was sparing her from the federal justice system. She opened her mouth, formulating a whisper of gratitude. I cut her off before a syllable escaped her lips. I told her she was not going to federal prison today. I watched her exhale a shuddering breath of relief, quickly extinguishing it. I calmly told her prison was far too easy a punishment. I stood and delivered the ultimate verdict. You are stripped of your CEO title, disinherited, and removed from the trust. You leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back to face the corporate lawsuits alone. You are no longer a coal in my eyes. The next morning, the Denver sun rose bright and relentlessly cold, casting a sharp, unforgiving light across the frost-covered grounds of my vast estate. I had not slept at all yet. I felt a profound surge of energy coursing through my veins. The suffocating fog of deception had finally been lifted, entirely replaced by the crystalline clarity of sheer survival. I dressed with meticulous care, selecting a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep crimson tie. I fastened my gold cufflinks with steady, unwavering hands. I was no longer the frail, deteriorating victim my daughter had so desperately wished to create. I was the absolute master of my own domain, stepping back into the light to reclaim the empire I had forged. I arrived at the towering glass and steel headquarters of Cole Commercial Properties just as the corporate staff began to filter through the revolving doors. I walked into the marble lobby. I stood perfectly tall, my posture radiating an undeniable, commanding authority. The ambient chatter instantly died down. Employees stopped in their tracks, their eyes widening in shock as they watched their supposedly failing patriarch stride across the polished floor with the vigorous, imposing confidence of a conqueror returning from a long, brutal, exhausting war. I bypassed my private elevator and walked straight into the executive suite. Natalie had spent the past 3 months quietly installing a network of loyal cronies, sycophants, and corrupt managers designed to facilitate her eventual hostile takeover. I did not waste a single second on corporate pleasantries or human resources protocols. I gathered them all in the central boardroom, flanked by Thomas and a formidable team of heavily armed corporate security officers. I fired every single one of them on the spot. I stripped them of their credentials, seized their digital access cards, and had them physically escorted out of the building before they could utter a single word of protest. The swift, brutal purge sent a shockwave of absolute terror and undeniable respect through the remaining ranks. I watched their arrogant expressions crumble into pure panic as they realized their treasonous reign was permanently over. They were permanently blacklisted from the sector. With the parasitic rot surgically removed from my organization, I called for Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan was a dedicated, brilliant vice president who had served my company with unwavering loyalty for over 20 years. He had watched Natalie bypass him with quiet dignity, never complaining, always putting the corporation first, firmly believing that hard work would eventually be recognized. I walked him into the boardroom and officially promoted him to the position of Chief Executive Officer. I handed him the reins to the daily operations, rewarding 2 decades of steadfast integrity and quiet dedication with the ultimate corporate crown. He accepted the responsibility with tears of profound gratitude shining in his tired eyes. I left Jonathan to address the stunned, revitalized staff and retreated into the quiet sanctuary of my corner office. I closed the heavy wooden door behind me, finally allowing myself a singular, uninterrupted moment of absolute silence. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling, magnificent Denver skyline I had personally helped build from nothing. The towering structures of glass and steel gleamed brilliantly in the bright morning sun, standing as undeniable monuments to my lifelong dedication. The absolute betrayal of my only child had left a deep, permanent scar on my soul, a painful, agonizing wound that would never truly heal. But the toxic rot had been completely eradicated from my life. The treacherous wolves who had patiently circled my dining table were gone forever, permanently banished to the cold, unforgiving wilderness of federal prison and total financial ruin. The old lion still ruled the pride, fiercely guarding the glorious gates of his enduring kingdom, ready to face whatever the future held with absolute unyielding strength. In business and in life, the most dangerous predators don't break through your windows. They sit at your dining table, smiling while pouring your soup. Never let familial love blind you to the cold, hard facts of betrayal. Trust is a beautiful thing, but blind trust is a death sentence. When you spend your life building an empire, you must have the courage to protect it, even if it means tearing down the very people you raised. Dignity and survival require us to face the agonizing truth. Sometimes the only way to save your legacy is to walk away alone. Have you ever experienced a dark betrayal from someone you completely trusted? How did you take your power back? Share your story in the comments below. If this video gave you chills, hit that subscribe button like this video and join our community for more intense, true survival stories today.